In his commentary to the Haggadah, the Rebbe referenced many different sources from the vast library of Judaism, but three stand out from a bibliographic perspective. Three references to the first dated printed edition of the Haggadah. Join us as we learn more about this edition, its historical context, and how the Rebbe used it to sort out some of the more famous questions relating to the nishtanah, dayeinu, and the wisdom of the wise son. In Tafshin Vav, 1946, the Rebbe released his Haggadah Shal Pesach. It was first released without the text of the Haggadah. It was just the comments. Later, in years after, it was they placed the text of the Haggadah on top of it, and they placed the Rebbe's comments below it as a commentary. In this commentary, in this Haggadah of the Rebbe, there's a lot there. And we're going to tonight focus on one interesting aspect. And that is, there are three instances where the Rebbe turns to and alludes to and mentions by name the first printing of the Haggadah. So we're going to do a deep dive into those three instances. And that's going to also lead us into exploring which Haggadah the Rebbe is referring to and perhaps notice a few interesting things along the way. So first up is when we come to the four questions. It's well known that there are different versions of the four questions. Today it's often said there's the Chabad way and the way the Welt does it and the way the world does it. So let's explore where this comes from. So if you open up your standard Gemara to Pesachim Daf Kuf Tezayin Amud Aleph, you will find over there the Mishnah. It has the Mishnah, and it's listing there in the Mishnah the four questions. And the first question is, all night we eat chametz u'matzah. The second question is, Shabachal alayla isanu eichlin sha'ar yerakais. The third question is about roasted meat, which we're going to ignore for the purposes of tonight. And the fourth and final question in the Mishnah is about dipping in 2 times. All year, there is no obligation to dip in even once. The Rebbe once by a Fabrengen and Tavsham Amalev spoke about the fact that there is an obligation to dip bread into salt, but that's not real halachic tibul. Halachic tibul is when you dip something into a moisture that therefore mandates netilas yadayim, or at least makes a shaila of netilas yadayim. That's called tibul. So challah in bread in salt doesn't count for that. And Rosh Hashanah, tibul in a dvash, it's not mamish a minig kavua. Some people do it, some people don't do it. It's not an established minig, it's definitely not mentioned in the Gemara. And so therefore we can say all nights there's no dipping, whereas on the night of Pesach there's 2 dips. This is the final question. The order here has a certain coherence. The order here goes from dayeinu, matzah bisman hazeh is dayeinu, morer bisman hazeh is, we assume, is derabanan, and the dipping is only in the category of a minig. So the seder over here makes a lot of sense. However, when we look at the Alter Rebbe's Siddur, and that it includes our Haggadah Shal Pesach, we find a different order. As the Rebbe points out in his Haggadah on page Yud Gimel, Matbilin is the first question, Matzah is the second question, Morer is the third question, and Misubin, reclining, is the final question. Now what we need to focus on is the fact that here, Matbilin, rather than coming after Matzah, comes before Matzah. That really is our focus over here. And the Rebbe says, so Hayatachin, where does this come from? So the answer is, B'seider zeh, the Rebbe writes, Hu b'mishnah she'b'Yerushalmi. We know that when you open a Talmud Bavli, you have the Mishnah presented on the daf. You open a Yerushalmi, you have the same Mishnah over there. But sometimes there are variations between how the Mishnah was transmitted in the Yerushalmi versus how it was transmitted in the Bavli. If you look at the Yerushalmi, you'll find that the first question is actually on Matbilin. Then the Rebbe goes further and quotes the Rif and the Rosh. So the Rif wrote a summary of the Talmud Bavli, not of the Yerushalmi, and the Rosh as well writes the Piskei Dinim in the Talmud Bavli, and over there as well, they have the Shaila of Tibul before the Shaila of Chametz HaMatzah. Now what does that immediately tell you? They weren't following Yerushalmi traditions, they were writing a commentary on the Bavli. Immediately that tells you that not only do you have a Yerushalmi way of reading the Mishnah, but in fact within the Bavli itself there are different traditions of what this Mishnah was supposed to be. In fact, if you go to, there's different kisvei yad. Today we have easy access to them. So I checked 10 different manuscripts of the Gemara from the 1200s to 1300s to 1400s. Of these 10 different manuscripts of the Talmud Bavli, 6 of them, Taka, had the Seder of Matbilin as the first question, and the other 4 of them had matzah as the first question. So in other words, within the tradition of the Talmud Bavli, there were variations in how this was supposed to happen. There's also a few kisvei yad, not many, of the entire Mishnah, just Mishnah without Gemara. I think there are 3 such kisvei yad. One of them is known as the Kaufman manuscript. That's because it's named after the collector, whose name was Kaufman, and it's in Budapest. So this Mishnah, it's very old. They think this manuscript comes from the 900s. So there also, if you look in Pesachim, you'll find that the first question is, Matbilin is question number 1, and Chametz and Matzah becomes question number 2. The Rebbe continues and quotes other sources that have this order. Siddur of Amram Goin. Rav Amram Goin is the Siddur we spoke about in a previous class. So the Rebbe notes that in the manuscript in the British Museum, that's because as follows. The standard Siddur of Amram Goin that was available when the Rebbe was writing this Pirush, the standard one, had the order Chametz, Matzah and Chametz first, and Matbilin was after. However, in the manuscript that was in the British Museum, and this was noted, in other words, people knew about it, even though they didn't have access to this manuscript, but in the standard editions, they wrote in footnotes that, by the way, in another edition, it's the other way around. So the Rebbe is counting that as another source. And then the Rebbe says, Siddur of Sadia Goin, he also wrote a Siddur there, also it's in this order. And then the Rambam is also in this order. In fact, the Rambam is 2 times, once in the Halachis, and then he gives the Seder of the Haggadah afterwards, and there as well, it follows this order. And so therefore, all of a sudden, rather than saying, oh, you're going against the Bavli, because we don't really want to be in a position where we're doing something that's against the Bavli. Generally speaking, we're supposed to follow the things that are in the Talmud Bavli. But suddenly we realize it's nishtanah pashat. You wouldn't have had all these people having a version that goes against the Talmud Bavli. Obviously, there were other versions, and as I said before, indeed, if you look at the manuscripts, you see there were other versions. And then the Rebbe adds the line that we're looking for, and that is V'cheinhu b'Haggadah harishayna shebetfus. Indeed, in the first Haggadah that was printed, and he gives the place and the day and the year, Soncino 1485. In this Haggadah it follows this order of Matbilin as the first question, followed by the question about Chametz and Matzah. So we're going to want to take a closer look at what this Haggadah from Soncino in 1485 is, but we're not going to do that just yet. We'll come back to that later to have a look at it. The Rebbe continues and explains as follows. The order that we have, that the Alter Rebbe has, is consistent with the chronology of the Seder. Why? What's the first thing we do? The first thing we do is Tibul, Karpas. Al Kopanim Arishan, although we don't do the second ones come later with the Mar, but the first one, which is all about getting the children to ask, what's the only real reason we're dipping in the Karpas into salt water, is so that the children are going to ask questions, and that's what this is all about. This is about questions. So therefore it makes sense to start off with that Tibul, it becomes the first question. Matzah comes later, Marer becomes later. Then you're left with the question, if it's about the chronology, what about Mesubin? Mesubin is reclining, and reclining you do even before Karpas, right when you have the first cup. So the Rebbe asks that question, and the Rebbe says, Kushis Mesubin eino b'chlal ana. We take Mesubin out of the chronology. Why? Because that question was added a long time after the previous 3 questions. When was that? When they stopped reclining all year. In other words, it was once a time, every person all the time was always reclining, so it wasn't unusual. When this became not normal, and we retained this for Pesach, so then it turned into a question. It's not mentioned in Shas, it's not mentioned in the Gemara, and so therefore that happened a lot later. So when they added it, they weren't going to mess up the order, and so they put it at the end. And that's why it's not in the Mishnah and the Gemara. Who is the source for this explanation about why Mesubin is at the end? That comes from the Gra. The Rebbe asks a question on this Gra, but we're not going to concern ourselves with that now because it's not our focus, so we're going to skip that. Therefore, all opinions agree that that's going to be the last one, meaning whether you follow the traditional Veltische way of saying nishtanah or whether you follow the Alter Rebbe's way of doing it, it's going to come at the end. And then the Rebbe concludes his comment by saying, relevant for our purposes, that if you look al pi Kabbalah in the Kisvei Arizal, meaning in the Pri Etz Chaim, it explains that Matbilin matzah, marar, mesubin correspond beautifully with momata lamaila, going from the lowest world to the highest world, namely from Asiya is Matbilin and Yetzira, Asiya is Matbilin, Yetzira is Matzah, and Bria is Marar, and Atzilus is Misubin. Not that there's any reclining, Momata Lamaila, yeah. You start from the lowest world to the highest world. So Atzilus is the highest world, and that corresponds to the question of Misubin. Not that there's any Misubin in Atzilus, reclining, which reminds me, there's a Maisa that Rabbi Zevin brings in his Sipurei Chsidim. He brings it about one of the tzaddikim, I don't remember which one, that he was once saying Torah by Shalashudas, and he started coughing. He was talking about Atzilus, and he was coughing, so his son brought over a cup of tea. So he said to his son, he doesn't want to drink the tea. And he said, in Atzilus is nishtanah tea. There's no tea in Atzilus. Okay. He's continuing to cough. So his son again offers him tea, refuses again, and Atzilus is no tea. Now it gets really bad, and he's coughing, and no one can really even understand what he's saying. So his son tries again and says, how about some tea? He says, in Atzilus there is no tea. So his son said, in Atzilus there's no coughing either. Anyway, so there's no aseba in Atzilus, but whatever the spiritual, I tried to check up the Priyetz Chaim to see what it says there. It was a very difficult passage to understand exactly what it meant, and so we're going to leave that alone. Ad Kan, we see what? This is the first instance in the Haggadah. The Rebbe refers to the Soncino 1485 edition of the Haggadah Shal Pesach, which he calls the first printing. We will return to that after we see the second, then we'll analyze this a little more closely. Okay, the second part requires a little bit of an introduction, and that brings us back to Rabbi Emanuel Chai Riki. We spoke about him a few weeks ago when we spoke about the Tzimtzum Kimpshutoi. His name came up then. He authored a sefer called Mishnas Chasidim. He was an Italian Mikubal. 1688, his birth date. 1743 is when he passed away. And in his Mishnas Chasidim, when he talks about the piyut of dayeinu, he writes like this: V'chamisha asar dayeinu there are 15 dayenus. And that corresponds to Mispar Yud Kei, which is the first two letters of Hashem's name. It's also treated as a name of Hashem for itself. And according to Kabbalah, this has deep significance because the Yud represents the Sphira of Chachma, and the Hey represents the Sphira of Bina, otherwise known as Av Va'em. In other words, like this: in the intellectual sphere, Chachma is the initial flash of creative energy, and Bina is the analysis of it. In the procreative sphere, Chachma is the male seed, and the Bina is the pregnancy that develops and fully develops the fetus. So these represent, Lamaila, these represent two types of powers. One is the Yud, that's the Chachma. Hey is the Bina. The gematria of Yud and Hey is Tesvav. And so beautiful, that's dayeinu. So if you learn about what dayeinu really is on a very deep level, you'll come to an understanding that it corresponds to Chachma and Bina, to Yud and to Hey, and to this name of Hashem. There's only one problem. As the Rebbe notes in his Haggadah on page Chavches, V'hinei lefi nuscha shalanu ein amelo yudal. If you count how many times it says the word dayeinu by us, you're going to find that there's only 14 dayenus. So what are we going to do? He says there's 15. What are you going to do? There's only going to be 14. So the Rebbe suggests a tentative answer. What's the tentative answer? The tentative answer will come, the Rebbe doesn't cite this Ritva, but this Ritva really personifies this answer. Let's look what the Ritva has to say in his commentary on the Haggadah. Look what he says. Kama mailas toives lamakim aleinu. This is how the piyut of dayeinu starts off. It begins with these words: how many mailas toives lamakim from God aleinu on us, which means kaloimar. What does this mean? Sha'asa aleinu v'sam banu. He made for us and placed into us how many great things. Okay, how many great things are in that list? So the answer is 15. There are taka 15. In other words, like this, let's remember what's happening here. You have, if you count alachas kama v'kama, you count through that whole list, there's 15 favors. There's 15. Starting with Shoytzionu miMitzrayim, ve'asa b'hem shvatim. If you count it all the way to the end, and he made the Beis HaBchira, l'chaper al kol aveinuseinu, there's 15. What happens is that when it's structured in the dayeinu, so the first stanza is, Ilu hoytzionu miMitzrayim, v'lo yasa b'hem shvatim dayeinu. So that's, the first two are in that first clause, in that first stanza. And so what happens is that if you count the dayenus, how many times you're saying, if we wouldn't have had that, it would have been enough. There's only 14 dayenus. But if you count the milos, the actual benefits, there you'll see that there are 15. So here you see that the Ritva is not talking about the word dayeinu, he's talking about the Mailos Toives, and he says there are 15. And he says the significance, just like Emmanuel Chayriki, just like the Mishnah Chassidim. He links it to Shem Yud-Kei, which is the pasuk Yud-Kei Surah Elamim. So he links it to that name of Hashem. And then he finds other areas in Yiddishkeit or in the Torah where the number 15 takes on significance. And he brings 3 examples. Number 1 is the eastern wall of the Mishkan, where you would enter from. So there couldn't have been a continuous curtain, because then how are you going to get in? So how was it structured? So the Torah says you had 15 amma closed up by one curtain, 15 amma closed up by another curtain, and then you had a gap in the middle, and then pushed back, you had another curtain, and like this you would go in from the side. So he looks at those shoulders, it's called. The shoulders that are 15 amma, he sees, oh, that's significant, the number 15 in the Mishkan. That's number 1. Then he says another example. If you look at Tehillim, we find Shir HaMalos, 15 times you have the concept of Shir HaMalos, where a capital Tehillim starts with Shir HaMalos. And then number 3, in the Beis HaMikdash, you had 15 steps, Tesvav Mailos, that were between the Ezras Nashim and the Ezras Yisrael, and those 15 steps are also significant. All of these instances of 15, they're not random, they're all exact, they're all representing something deep and something profound, and all of this, again, if you understood dayeinu really well, you understood what dayeinu was all about, you would see the link between all of these things. So now, this would be a possible answer. That when he says this Tesvav Dayenus, he doesn't mean the dayeinu part, doesn't mean the stanzas of the dayeinu poem, of which there are 14, which culminates with the words of dayeinu. What he means is, how many Mailos Toivos do you have mentioned in the whole piyut? There you have 15. The only problem is, the Rebbe says, V'yesh loimer b'doichik. You could say it as a doichik. That instead of focusing on the dayenus, focus on the mailos. But the Rebbe calls this a doichik, which means it's not such a geschmack answer, it's not such a good answer. At the end of the day, he didn't say there's chamisha asar mailos, he said there's chamisha asar dayenus, and so therefore it's a little bit of a problem. The Rebbe continues and says, I come up with a solution. The Rebbe offers a very interesting solution to untangle the Mishnah Chassidim from this dilemma. The Rebbe cites an earlier posuk, the Shibale Haleka to Reb Tzidkiya HaRoifa Min HaAnovim. This is the family. Is a very chashva, famous family in Italy that were known as the Anovim family. They had a tradition that they were in Italy all the way from the time of the Churban Bayis, and they were very proud of their heritage. And among them, you had the Shibale Haleka. We mentioned him a few weeks ago, I believe. And look what he does when he talks about the Ilu Hoitzianus, when he talks about the Dayenus. We'll read the Keta in a second, but you'll see he had Tezayin Mailos, not Tezvav Mailos. He had Tezayin Mailos, which means he had 15 stanzas, which means he had 15 Dayenus. In other words, he had an added clause. So let's read inside to see what the extra clause is. Zok the Shibale Aleket. If God had taken us into Eretz Yisrael and wouldn't have built for us the Beis HaMikdash, that would have been dayeinu. That's tremendous love. That would have been enough. Okay, good. Now that's how our thing ends. We have the word Beis HaBchira, not Beis HaMikdash, but that's how our thing ends. However, he continues, after he did both of these things. Number 1, to bring us into Eretz Yisrael. And number 2, to build us the Beis HaMikdash. What does it mean, this Beis HaMikdash that we just spoke about? Zehu oyol moyed. This is the Mishkan. Shenis yashev b'noi v'givain v'shiloi. The Mishkan, we often think about it as the Mishkan Hamidbar, in the desert. But you have to remember, the Mishkan also lives on in Eretz Yisrael. You didn't come into Eretz Yisrael for the first few hundred years. There's a Mishkan, 3 places: Noiv, Givoin, and Shiloi. And so, when it says Beis HaMikdash, if he would have brought us into Eretz Yisrael and wouldn't have built a Beis HaMikdash, that's only referring to the Mishkan. Why am I calling Mishkan Mikdash? Because the pasuk does in Parshas Truma. It says Va'asuli Mikdash. So if God would have done that, V'loi bana lanu as Beis HaBchira, and wouldn't have built on top of that the Beis HaBchira, which is the Beis HaMikdash that Shlomo HaMelech built, and that's called Beis Elamim, and that's called Beis HaBchira, the house that God chose. Al Shem HaMakam Asher Yivchar Hashem, the place that God is going to choose, clearly is a reference to the Yerushalayim, to the Beis HaMikdash. And once you have the Beis HaMikdash, then there's no heter anymore for bamais. People can't offer sacrifices locally. So if Hashem would have done that, that would have been enough. Kol Shekain Shasimanu Kalele did all of this. And so how is the ending of the dayeinu piyut for Shibale Aleket? Ilu Chnisana L'Eretz Yisrael, and wouldn't have made for us a Mishkan dayeinu. Ilu, if he would have made a Mishkan for us and wouldn't have made for us a Beis HaMikdash, also would have been dayeinu. Now he already addressed, how could you call the first one Mikdash? How can you call Mishkan Mikdash? So he said, what's the problem? Vasuli Mikdash, clearly he's going on the Mishkan. He then gives another answer. Va'al tisma, don't worry. Why is it calling the Mishkan a Beis HaMikdash? Because look in the Gemara in Zvachim, Daf Kuf Yud Beis Hamid Beis, and it describes over there that the Mishkan in Eretz Yisrael was Bayish al Avanim o Mata, V'yiriyis Ukrashim o Maila. It had regular walls, had a foundation, and it had regular brick walls or whatever it was made out of. And what made it resemble the Mishkan rather than a proper building is that the roof was made out of the animal hides, just like in the Mishkan. So therefore, it makes even more sense to call it a Mikdash. Because remember, we're talking about the Mishkan in Eretz Yisrael. We're not talking about the Mishkan in the Midbar. And so therefore, this is another reason why the word Mikdash works very well when you want to talk about and designate the Mishkan the way it stood in Eretz Yisrael. And then he says, this whole thing I explained based on the commentary that my brother Rebbe Binyamin gave me. I think last time we spoke about the Shibale Aleket, I think we also quoted from his brother. Once you have this, all of a sudden we have a solution for the Mishnah Chassidim. Why? Because now, as you can tell, we're going to have 15 dayenus. As the Rebbe notes in the Haggadah, Shuv Matzasi, after realizing this problem for the Mishnah Chassidim, I found Asher B'Shibale Aleket, the Girsa is, and the Girsa, and the Rebbe quotes the Girsa that we just read. And now comes the second time the Rebbe references the first printing of the Haggadah. And he says, this is also in the first printing of the Haggadah LePesach, which, if you want to know where it is, Mitoich Machzer Soncino, it's within the Machzer published by the Soncino. You need to know the year, right? Hey Reish Mem Vav. Hey Reish Mem Vav corresponds to the year 1486. So there too, they end up having this extra stanza of dayeinu. Now right away you'll notice that the reference here to the first printing of the Haggadah is a little different than the reference the first time of the Haggadah. The first time he just said, Soncino 1485. Here he tells you it's part of a machzer. Okay, it's a little more information. Here he uses a Hebrew date rather than an English secular date. And in fact, you have to really wonder right now, 1485 and Reish Mem Vav, 1485, 1486 is a little bizarre. It's a little bizarre. Obviously, you all understand that the first 3 months of the year, Hey Reish Mem Vav, is still 1485 until January 1st comes, then it changes over to 1486. But it's a little bizarre that this happened. And I'm going to warn you now, I don't have a perfect solution for this. I'm going to give you answers that are going to kick the can down the road, but I don't want to disappoint you at the end. I don't have perfect answers to these questions, as we'll soon see. Okay. But why is this relevant? Now look at the chat that the Rebbe introduces over here. The Rebbe says, okay, what's the common denominator between the Shibale Aleket and this Machzer Soncino? Both of them are what? From Italy. Shibale Aleket lived in Italy in the 1200s. This Machzer was printed, this Haggadah was printed in Italy in the 1400s. Where was the Mishnah Chassidim from? Where was Emmanuel Chayriki from? He was also from Italy. He lived almost all his life in Italy. I think he moved a little to Eretz Yisrael for a year or two. And everyone in Mishnah Chassidim, he wrote in Italy. So therefore, it makes so much sense to say that he would have had a nusach that the Soncinos printed 200 years before him. He would have had a nusach that the Shibale Aleket had a few hundred years before him. So it's very geschmack. The Italians had their own nusach. This is essentially what the Rebbe is connecting the dots over here. And in this way, we resolve the thing. Why does he say 15 dayenus? Because if you are an Italian Jew, like the Mishnah Chassidim, then indeed, there's a very good chance that you are going to have. As the Rebbe says, sim leiv, when you pay attention or you take note of the fact. Asher Bala Machaber Sefer Mishnah Chassidim Chai Italia, lived in Italy. Makam Bala Machaber Sefer Shibale Aleket V'Tfus Soncino, the place of Reb Tzidki HaRoifa and the place of the Soncino press. So Karl Levada, it makes so much sense to say Asher Gam Hu Achaz Benuscha Shalem. He agreed with their nusach, and that's why he wrote that we have here Tes Vav Dayenus. However, the Rebbe ends with a problem. What's the problem? This is a perfect solution for the Mishnah Chassidim. What are you going to do about others? Who are the others? So, there was a yid by the name of Reb Shapsi Roshkever. Reb Shapsi Roshkever, he already had passed away by 1794, because he lived during the times of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid. 1794 was his Siddur was published. It's his Siddur, the Kavanas of the Arizal, teachings of the Arizal. It has a nusach over there of Tefillah as well. And the problem there is, he calls it Tesvav Dayenus. And it's very difficult to suggest that a Jew living in Eastern Europe, in Poland, Romania, Russia, that area, he didn't have the Italian nusach. He would have to bring evidence to suggest that. So why does he have Tesvav Dayenus? And so therefore, because he uses the words there, Tesvav Dayenus. So therefore the Rebbe writes, B'siddur of Shapsi Rashkever Tzarech Chiyun, it's Tzarech Chiyun, and the Rebbe leaves it like that in the Haggadah. The Rebbe returned to that years later, as we'll soon see, but let's continue moving on. Before we get a little closer into analyzing which Haggadah the Rebbe is talking about, I just want to point out that there are at least 3 additional sources, all from Italian origin, that have this extra line of the dayeinu. I'll just show you one particular source. This is a man by the name of Rabbi Eliezer Nachman of Foa, and he had his Pirush Haggadah Shal Pesach printed in the year 1641. So he's before the Mishnah's Chassidim. He's Italian through and through, and he brings the same nusach. He actually offers a little bit of a different explanation. He says the first one is, if Hashem would have brought us into Eretz Yisrael and wouldn't have given us the Beis HaMikdash for Karbanos dayeinu, if he would have given us the Beis HaMikdash for Karbanis, but wouldn't have given us the Kodesh HaKadoshim, also dayeinu. What's the difference? So he says, the first one, Karbanis, is Kapara. The second one is, Kodesh HaKadoshim is God dwelling within us, and so, and that's remained with us till today. We don't have Karbanis anymore today. So if you say, where's your Mizbeach today in Yerushalayim? There is none. If I say, where's your Kodesh HaKadoshim today? You have an answer. Why? He says, a Kos HaMaravi. Because there are sources that say the Shekhinah is present by the Kos HaMaravi. So in that sense, that's an added gift of not only a Karbanis Beis HaMikdash, but also of a Hashras HaShekhinah Beis HaMikdash. And this is his beer that Rebbe Eliezer Nachman Foa says, and he concludes by saying, Kein Tigala Le'ene Kol Ha'amim B'mheira V'yameinu. So I'm bringing just one additional source. There are others as well, all from Italy, that have this extra source. And so therefore the hypothesis that the Rebbe presents over here is actually very well grounded. Okay. Now, so we need to understand which Haggadah the Rebbe is referring to here. So let's talk for a minute about printing, just to put what we're going to talk about in the context of the history of printing and Jewish printing. The Gutenberg, Johannes Gutenberg, printed his German edition of the Bible, or it was a Latin edition of the Bible, I'm not sure, in the year 1455. This is considered the invention of the printing press, at least in the Western world. The first few years, we don't see any printing of Jewish books. However, 15 years later, in Italy, we see the printing of Jewish books. The problem is these don't have dates. There are 8 svarim that are known to have been printed around the year 1470, 1471, 1472. None of them have colophons. None of them have an exact date on it. But there's a whole scholarship that goes into the study of fonts and the study of paper, and they're able to track and trace these things. Jews were not allowed to print in Germany, which is why they didn't get involved there. But in Italy, it looks like Jews were allowed to get involved, and we have svarim that were printed from around that time. The first sefer that has a date on it is, we actually showed it in a previous class here. There's a Rashi that was printed in Italy in 1475, and it has a colophon, and so it has a date, and we know exactly that where it was printed in Reggio di Calabria in Italy, 1475, and there's a few pages of this in the Rebbe's library. When it comes to the Haggadah Shal Pesach, so it works as follows. Today, the assumption is that the first Haggadah, I think I mentioned this last week, the first Haggadah that we know, there are things we don't know, the first Haggadah that we know was printed in 1482 in Spain. Now, we have to be careful here. There is no colophon on this Haggadah. So again, it's guessed based on the fonts and based on paper, and I don't know enough to be able to weigh in on whether this is a good guess, not such a good guess, or whatever. But this is the assumption. However, this Haggadah was unknown for many, many, many years that it exists. I believe there's one copy in the world in the National Library in Israel. They printed a facsimile of this in 1961. Before 1960s, maybe the 50s, there's no talk of this. It was unknown. The Rebbe is clearly not referring to that Haggadah. In fact, if you look at that Haggadah, he does not have an extra stanza of Ilu Hoitzianu. The order of the questions actually in that Haggadah is with the matbil in question first, but there is no extra stanza of dayeinu over there. But anyway, the Rebbe says Soncino and Italy, and talking about Italy, this is Spain, that's a whole other thing. Again, was unknown in the 1946 when the Rebbe was making this Haggadah. That was completely unknown. So let's move away from that particular Haggadah. So that brings us to two other known Haggadahs, both printed by Soncino in the 1480s in Italy. So first, let's look at this page over here. This page over here. Have it? Have this? Okay. So this page here, you see, is the beginning of the Haggadah. You see, Hey Lach Ma'anya. You look at the nishtanah over here. What's the first question? The first question is Chametz and Matzah. So the Rebbe can't be referring to this one. Okay, you look on the left-hand side, there's the dayeinus, right? There's one. Ilu nishtanah l'Eretz Yisrael, v'loy van olanu as beis habchira, beis hamikdash, dayeinu. There is no two dayenus for a beis hamikdash and a beis habchira or anything of the sort. So obviously, the two things that we've been looking for are not present in this Haggadah. So we know that it's not this. But let me tell you what this is. In the JTS library here in New York, you have a siddur. The siddur was printed by Soncino, and the siddur has a colophon. The colophon I put on the bottom of the page, right under the images here. So it says like this: Uvechein or vechan nishlama melechas hakodesh. The early printers, when they would write their work, they would always call it melechas hakodesh. They saw it as holy work. Tfilas yachid, that was the siddur. Hanuhuga livnei amenu kal kodesh roima. They made a siddur for the Roman Jewish community. V'hoisa ashlamas chakikasam, the end of the chakika, the carving. That was the way they referred to printing in those years. Poi Soncin, here in Soncino. Shnei yamim lechodesh ir beis ir shnas masayim. Vishisha v'arboim le'elef hashlishi. That is the year 5000 Hey Reish Mem Vav, which corresponds to 1486. This is the colophon of this siddur. Now as follows: this siddur does not have a Haggadah Shal Pesach in it. However, this copy in New York in the JTS library has at the end a Haggadah smacked on after the colophon. A colophon usually is going to be at the end of the book. At the end, after the colophon, all of a sudden it's Haggadah Shal Pesach. So they look at the binding, and it looks like that it was added later. It could be mamish in that generation, but it doesn't look like it was part of the original binding. However, the page sizes are exactly the same. The fonts are exactly the same. And so therefore it stands to reason that it was printed by Soncino around that time. So when people refer to this Haggadah, they refer to it as the Soncino Haggadah from 1486, because the siddur is from the year Hey Reish Mem Vav. And so therefore, if the siddur was from Hey Reish Mem Vav, it stands to reason that the Haggadah that seems so similar is also from that year. But again, the Rebbe is not referring to this because, first of all, I don't even know if this was known in 1946 when the Rebbe was working on his Haggadah. But secondly, it doesn't have the girses that Rebbe is referring to. And so clearly we can move this away, and we know that it's not this particular Haggadah, even though it's possible that this is going to have been printed before the next one that we're going to talk about. Now go to this page over here. This page over here. You see where it says, Hey Lach Ma'anya? So the first thing I want you to notice here is the Hey, the artwork for the Hey Aleph is the same artwork as here. Okay? It's the same woodcut design for the Hey and the Aleph. So that's good, but we're going to see here, this was printed by the same print house. So it makes sense that they would use the same technologies and the same things. So if you look at the nishtanah over here you're able to see clearly on the right-hand side, what's the first question? Ein anu metablim afilu pam achas. Halayla azeh shtei pamim. Then comes the question of chametz and matzah. That's number one. Number two, if you go to the left-hand side, you look at the ilu hoitzianus, look at the last two. The last two are ilu ichnesanu l'Eretz Yisrael v'lo vanu lanu as beis hamikdash dayeinu, and the next one is ilu vanu lanu as beis hamikdash v'lo vanu lanu as beis habchira dayeinu. Boom. So we nailed it. We found it. This is the one that the Rebbe is referring to. So now let's learn about this. When was this produced? So now go to the next page. Go to the next page. This one. Everyone has this page? Yep. Okay, go to the top image. The top image here is as follows. This Haggadah comes from a huge 2-volume machzer that was called Machzer Roima. That was printed, is the first printing of a very famous book that was printed many times. That's the tefillas for a whole year, machzer, a cycle, the cycle of the whole year. And in volume 1, they have Haggadah Shal Pesach. At the end of volume 2, they have a colophon. You can read the colophon. I typed out the words, the relevant words right under it. We started this book, al dayeinu, us, bnei Soncino, the children of Soncino, meaning two things. From the Soncino family, meaning their father. Ba'ir Soncino, in the city of Soncino. B'chodesh Tishrei, in the month of Tishrei, Shnas Reish Mem Vav La'elaf Hashishi. Okay, so they started in Tishrei in the year Reish Mem Vav, which means, if you want to be exact, they actually started in the year 1485. So all of a sudden, now we're maybe getting a little bit of a solution to our 1485 problem. Continue. Vishlamnuhu Poi, and we finished it here in a different place. Kazal Miyori, another city in Italy. Bisheni B'Shabbos on a Monday. B'Esengen L'Chedesh Elul, at the 20th of Elul. Shnas Chameshes Alafim Masayim V'Shisha V'Arba'in L'Brias Olam, that's the same year. That's Reish Mem Vav. Dayeinu, which means it took a Shana Tmima B'Karev. It was ready right before Rosh Hashanah. It's right? Chav Elul, we have a machzer if you want for the tefillas, for Rosh Hashanah, because this machzer had the tefillas of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Okay, it took a full year to work on this. It started in the year 1485, it ended in the year Reish Mem Vav. So now we understand what the Rebbe is referring to. The Rebbe is referring to, the second time he says, it's from a machzer, and he calls it Reish Mem Vav. That's accurate. He also, the first time, says Soncino 1485. That's also accurate theoretically because the printing started in 1485. But that only kicks the can down the road in terms of asking the question. Why in the world would the Rebbe the first time refer to, read the colophon, and then see that, the cheshbon comes out to 1485, and so therefore write 1485, and then the other time write Hey Reish Mem Vav? What's going on over here? Still just doesn't make sense. It's bizarre. So you need to ask yourself another question. Did the Rebbe have access to this machzer roima? So what's interesting is this is incunabula. This is a very, very priceless item. It was printed in 1486. Anything printed before 1501 is very, very valuable. What's interesting is usually incunabula, how many editions come down to us today? 1, 2, 3, 4 copies, very few. This one, for whatever reason, there's like 40 of them around in the world, so a lot of them exist. Okay. That said, I don't think the Rebbe had access to this one. It's not here in the library. They don't have a copy to this. Okay, but this, nonetheless, was well known. Why was it well known? Because in 1923 in Germany, there was someone who said, hey, why don't we make a facsimile of the first printed Haggadah? And he knew this machzer was famous, and so he took just the pages of this Haggadah, he published a facsimile of it, gave it a title page, published it, and the world knew now you could get a copy of the first Haggadah. Look at the Hebrew title page. Let's read it. Facsimile azu, mitfus rishon shal Haggadah lePesach, or the first printing of the Haggadah lePesach, and it comes from mitoich machzer Soncino Reish Mem Vav, the year Reish Mem Vav. And now it tells you who made it and where it was printed, and there was 400 copies that were made available. Okay, and then it says the printer, Berlin, Tov Reish Pei Gimel, 1923. The Rebbe's library today, there's a copy of this facsimile, and that's where I got this image from. I got it from there. Okay, so I had a feeling that you're going to come to the solution 1485 from this facsimile as well. Why? On one side, there's a Hebrew title page. Now look at the German title page on the other side. So I don't read German, so I don't know everything that it says over here, but it's something like this facsimile of the first druk of the Pesach Haggadah from the Machzer Soncino, 1485. Why did they write here 1485? Because they want to sell more copies. 1485 sounds better than 1486. Technically, you could squeeze in 1485 because the printing started. What's koveya? The start date or the end date? So there's no rules, so you can decide whatever you want. So they decided that they're going to write. In Hebrew, you can't do it because they taka start in Reish Mem Vav. You can't play games. In English, you could play games. In German, you could play games. And so to up the price and the value of it, they wrote 1485, and this is the other title page. So now I understand the Rebbe didn't create 1485. It's not like he made a cheshbon about when it was. He drew 1485 from the German title page, and he took the Hey Reish Mem Vav from the Hebrew title page. Which therefore the question is, why here did he do it this way, and here did he do it that way? And I don't have an answer for you. That's why I told you, lechatchila, don't get too excited. I'm going to have the key and the solution to this problem, because I don't. And this is where the question remains. It's very odd. And the Rebbe left it that way. And here you have Soncino 1485. Here you have Machzer Hey Reish Mem Vav. I'm looking for someone to enlighten me. Maybe I don't know. Maybe it's fine. You could do it either way. Ich weiß nicht. Ad kan benegea, identifying which Haggadah this is. Okay. Now, there is a third mention of the first Haggadah, and I want to show you this as well. Before we get there, I need to show you that the Rebbe came back to this issue about the dayenus and the number of the dayenus. The Rebbe came back to this many, many years later. The story that happened is as follows. In 1986, there was a Yid in Yerushalayim, his name was Rabbi Yosef Parush, and he published a new edition just of the Haggadah with the commentary of Reb Shapsi of Roshkov. Okay? Which means that when it came to the dayeinu, what's Reb Shapsi of Roshkov going to say? There's 15 dayenus. When in reality, in all the nuschos, including in that nusach, there's only 14. So this Reb Yosef Parush wrote V'tzarechiyun. This makes no sense. L'fi hanuscha shalanu, we only have Yudalet Pamim dayeinu. Then he wrote as follows. See the Haggadah Shal Pesach Likutei Tamim and Hagim for the Rebbe of Lubavitcher Shlita, who brings another girsa. That maybe you need to add a clause. In other words, what's he trying to say? Maybe the solution to the Shapsi Roshkov problem is to do something that's very difficult to suggest. And that is to say that Reb Shapsi Roshkov was writing a liba to a nusach that Reb Shapsi Roshkov probably wasn't aware of and definitely didn't use, but maybe that's a solution because the Rebbe of Lubavitch wrote in his Haggadah that you have another one. Okay. He sent a copy of this into the Rebbe, and the publisher also sent a copy, so today there's 2 copies of this in the library. It looks like Behemshech Lazeh the Rebbe wrote a note. No one as of now that I was able to know knows why he wrote the note, to whom he wrote the note, was it delivered to someone, but there is a note that was found with the Rebbe's handwriting. And the note at the Rebbe's handwriting, clearly the Rebbe was not happy with this comment that was put into the Haggadah of Reb Shapsi Roshkov, saying that the solution to his problem is what? That, there's another girsa. You understand the problem with that. You can't say that. You can't say that he's working with a different girsa. So what did the Rebbe write on this note? The Rebbe wrote like this. V'toiva dayeinu ates vav. Look what the Rebbe does here. There's 15 toivas. When we say 15 dayenus, we mean 15 toivas. It's the same thing. Don't nickel and dime me over here that there's only 14 dayenus. The dayenus is the name of the song that has 15 miles and the story. And what is the 15th one? It's Banu Lanu is Beis HaBchira, building the Beis HaMikdash. And that's the main one, because that's L'chaper al Kol Aveineseinu. And that's the answer. You want to know why Shapsi Roshkov wrote 15 dayenus? Because there's 15 miles, and that's what dayeinu is all about. It's all about 15 miles. And the story. Then, yes, and the Rebbe in the Haggadah said that to say that is the meaning is a doichik. Correct, the Rebbe said. And therefore, the Rebbe ended off and said that for Shapsi Roshkov tzarechiyun. Now goes further. Look what the Rebbe continued writing in the note. Hagirsa shehiskarti. This additional girsa that I wrote, that is another stanza 2 about the Beis HaMikdash that equals 15. Hu lichiduda. This in rabbinic language is when the Tanoim would say something wrong, but sharp. In other words, it has educational value for me or for the students, but it's not true, then I'll write it. The Rebbe is using here that language, lichiduda, that's not the real answer. Kipashut, obviously. Okay, I'm struggling with this. I struggle with this because in the Haggadah the Rebbe wrote that it's a huge doichik to, in the Haggadah the Rebbe wrote, tzarech iyon on Shapsi Roshkov. When you write tzarech iyon on Shapsi Roshkov, you write that's lichiduda. To take a rabbi and write tzarech iyun about him, that doesn't. And the Rebbe brought this answer in the Haggadah, said it's a doichik, and now the Rebbe is saying it's the main answer. So I don't know. That's number 1. But number 2, it is possible. You have to remember the context. That's why checking up this volume today in the Rebbe's library was so important. They tried suggesting the extra girsa into Shapsi Roshkov. That's a huge doichik. You can't suggest that he had that extra girsa. Maybe, I'm just saying maybe, and what I'm saying now is also a little doichik. Maybe what the Rebbe means is, the girsa that I mentioned, for you to slip that into Shapsi Roshkov, that you could only do lichiduda, kipashut. But you can't do that as a real thing. For the Mishnah's Chassidim, it's a real beer, it's a real answer. It's not a doichik, that's a geschmacke answer. But for Shapsi Roshkov, that's taka a doichik. And if you want to say it, it's lichiduda only. And the better answer to say for Shapsi Roshkov is to say, when he said 15 dayenus, he meant 15 miles. And that's I think maybe perhaps what the kavan is. Okay, before we go to the third, so that's just an interesting take 2 to this whole thing. To close out on dayeinu, I just want to share a word that the Rebbe said, the Farbrengen of Lil Beis, the Chag HaPesach, Tavshin Tez Zayin, a very interesting minhag Chabad has, and where we do not pause between the dayenus. The Welt has a song, dayeinu, and so if you sing it between every few clauses, so then you're pausing. And it says, the Rebbe writes on this Haggadah, Ein mafsikin ba'amiras ha'arba esre dayeinu. The Rebbe was careful to write the word ha'arba esre dayeinu, because only 14, right? But ein mafsikin, we don't stop, we don't make a hefsik. Why? What's the significance of that? What is it? So the Rebbe explained that, what's dayeinu? Dayeinu is genug. Dayeinu is genug. So you're saying genug, it's a nice thing, because you're recognizing, if I only had this, it's a nice, so you need to recognize the achievements. You need to recognize the blessings that Hashem gave you. So in that sense, saying dayeinu is a very, very good thing. However, saying dayeinu could also be a terrible thing. In the sense like, I'm good, I'm enough, I achieved this, now let's sing about it. Dayeinu, dayeinu. That resembles not only gratitude and acceptance and realizing what you accomplished, but that resembles, that singing, that ay, it signifies satisfaction and being stationary where you are. That we don't want to do. You say dayeinu, you move on right away to the next one. This is the significance of this in Avodah. When you were in Mitzrayim, you just got out. You're like, what do you mean? I accomplished this in Mitzrayim, it's good enough. You can't stop here. Say dayeinu, but move on. You need to go weiter. Okay, now let's close out with the third instance where the Rebbe uses this first edition of the Haggadah. I should note, by the way, I didn't mention this before. I should note that this is the first edition of the Haggadah that has a date, that has a colophon. That's really, really important. The other one may have been printed before. This one, the JTS one, may have been printed before, but maybe after. We don't know. And the one from Spain, again, it's great, but we don't have a date. This is the oldest dated Haggadah Shal Pesach. Okay. So the third time the Rebbe refers to this Haggadah Shal Pesach, dated in terms of print. The third time is on the question of the Chacham. It's a very, very well-known problem when it comes to the Shaila of the Chacham and the Rasha. How do we know the Rasha is a Rasha in his question? It's because he says, Ma avodah hazois lachem. He excludes himself. Lefi shahoitzi is atzma min haklal. What's the problem? Go to the question of the Chacham, and the language of the question is Ma edus hachokim v'amishpatim asher tziva Hashem elakeinu eschem, you guys. So you have the same problem. So the Rebbe addresses this, and he says, what's the answer? Eschem means kaloimar atem sheyotzasem mimitzrayim. What we means is, what did Hashem command you? In the sense that He commanded you because you went out of Mitzrayim, so you received the Torah, so you heard it directly. I only heard it second person. I didn't hear it directly. That's what eschem means. Shaya hadavar aleichem. It happened to you, and you heard the command. Good. It can't be that He means commanded you and not me. Because what does He say right before the word eschem? Our God. So if it's our God, so He's including Himself. So that's how, from Elokeinu we learn that He's the Chacham, that He's including Himself. Eschem just means, look, I didn't hear it directly, you guys heard it directly. I didn't experience it directly, you experienced it directly. Who says to read it this way? Who offers this solution? The Machzer Vitri, the Talmud of Rashi, writing in the 1000s, in his Sefer, he's the one who tells us that this is the solution to this problem. Good. Then the Rebbe continues, and the Rebbe writes as follows. I want you to know, Asher b'Yerushalmi, when you have the Yerushalmi, this drasha about the 4 sons is in the Yerushalmi, and it's derived from the Psukim. And in the Mechilta, also, in Parshas Boy, the Mechilta also gives a drasha about the 4 sons. The Rambam, when he gives his Nusach Haggadah, Hagirsa Kan, the Girsa is Oisanu, B'makoim Eschem. In other words, you have places where the Chacham is actually saying, Ma edus v'achokim asher tziva Hashem alekeinu oisanu. So it's even better. He's saying oisanu, us. He's not excluding himself from the klal. Where do you have this? In the Yerushalmi, this is what you have. In the Mechilta, this is what you have. In the Rambam, this is what you have. What's actually interesting is that it's not in all Rambams. The Rebbe says in the Rambam. I saw someone here and through another few places, when the Rebbe says the Rambam has it this way, the Rambam has it that way, was able to figure out which print of the Rambam the Rebbe was using when he worked on his Haggadah. Because some of the standard prints don't have Oisanu over here. Most of the standard prints don't have Oisanu over here. So that's an interesting thing. That's a side point. Okay. Now, the Rebbe continues, indeed, if you look at the first printed Haggadah, you're going to find that it says there, Oisanu. So look back over here, that same page, you have Chacham HaOimer, right, like on the right-hand side toward the bottom. It says Chacham HaOimer, Ma'edus v'achukim v'amishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu Oisanu. There you have it right there. Okay? And so, this is the third time that the Rebbe is referring to the first Haggadah that is printed. Okay, but now we have a problem. We have a question. What's going on over here? You have a pasuk that says Eschem. You have a pasuk that says Eschem. So he comes a Yerushalmi and a Mechilta and whoever it is, I don't care. First Haggadah, second Haggadah, and they're going to change the pasuk to Oisanu. Why? Because you have a Shaila? Because you have a Shaila, so you're changing it to Oisanu. What's happening over here? The Rebbe doesn't explain. The Rebbe just says, by the way, there's another girsa. That needs a little unpacking. That you need to tell me what to do with that information. How should I interpret the fact that there's another girsa? So there's two options. Option number one, which I don't think we would want to say this without having persuasive evidence that the Rebbe meant this, is that it's another Zecher story. In other words, just like you have some places where it says Zecher, some places where it says Zecher, and you get a whole discussion of which one is the right one. And there are other instances, Psuadakas with an Aleph or with a Hey, and you can make a list of these types of things. Maybe here we're dealing with another issue. Maybe the Yerushalmi and the Mechilta and the Rambam and the first printing of the Haggadah are representing a no longer accepted Messiah to write the Sefer Torah in a way where it said Oisanu. And maybe that's where the drasha came from. Look, he says Oisanu, so he's mamish good. Now he says Elokeinu, and he says Oisanu, so he's mamish the opposite of the Rasha. Okay, but then, that for whatever reasons that will never be known, it was determined to be not the right way to write Sifrei Torah. And so instead of writing Oisanu, we wrote Eschem. We kept the drasha nonetheless because it still works. And so this is, maybe that's what the Rebbe means. It's possible. But like to start introducing this element of like a different way of writing the Sefer Torah is a very difficult thing to do. So perhaps then, what we mean here is something else. Perhaps what we mean is the Machzor Vitri just finished telling us that he doesn't mean Eschem. Okay, but it says Eschem. Yeah, when he said Eschem, he was just trying to say, you guys heard it, you guys experienced, but he doesn't mean Eschem lahoitzi hasam min hakla. So in other words, what does he really mean? He really means Oisanu. That's really what he means. If he really means Oisanu, so then when the Mechilta is saying the drasha, instead of quoting the pasuk exactly, it says what he really means. It says his machshava rather than his the lashon of the pasuk. So it could be that's what we're saying over here, that these other girsas are telling us, they're clarifying for us what was on this chacham's chacham's mind. Machzor Vitri told us. So Menachem Kasher has in his Haggadah, he says that he saw a manuscript in the JTS that on the side has this little beer. It says it's some Haggadah say Oisanu. The pasuk says Eschem. Yeah. We're not trying to quote the pasuk here. We're trying to tell you what he really means. And if you want to know what he really means, he means Oisanu. And so this is why those girsas take that approach. There's also, the Machzor Vitri told us, Eschem means you guys experienced it, you heard it firsthand. I didn't. So there's a Rav, Rabbi Kasher brings this as well, Rab David Tzvi Hoffman in Germany before World War II, where he writes that Eschem is because Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to the Yidden. And he's saying, your children are going to ask you, not me. Your children aren't going to ask me. Eschem, you're going to have to deal with this type of question. So it's not part of the quote of the child. Your child is going to say, who's going to have this experience? Eschem, you. I'm not going into Eretz Yisrael. So I'm not going to have this experience. So that's his knetch of how he deals with the word Eschem. Okay. So this is the third instance where the Rebbe refers to this first printing of the Haggadah. And I want to now conclude on time, early, B'ezras Hashem, with, according to Chassidus,
It's the wrong time.
Oh, it's the wrong time? Oh my God. Okay. I want to conclude, not early, but in 60 seconds, with a quote from the Rebbe about Eschem according to Chassidus. Why does it say Eschem according to Chassidus? It says as follows. Und das ist the Pirish, and this is L'kut HaSichos Chelek Gimel. Und das ist the Piddish Chacham Mahu Omer. The Chacham refers to the neshama of every Jew. The Rebbe explains as follows. All four sons represent all four. Each of us have all four sons within us. Chacham is the way your neshama is in Atzilus. Atzilus is complete purity. Neshama shanasata bi tahirahi is the way the neshama is in Atzilus. So Chacham Ma'u Omer is the way, if you want to know what your soul sounds like in the purest way, in an Atzilus way, that's Chacham Ma'u Omer. Listen closely to that passage, Chacham Ma'u Omer. You'll hear the echoes of your neshama as it's expressing purity from Chacham Atzilus. What does he say? So this neshama turns to the guf, and he says to the guf as follows: Why? You guys, you, Eschem, you have edus, you have chukim, you have mishpatim. Three types of mitzvahs. Chukim is where you're subservient, you put your mind aside. Eidos is where you understand it a little, you wouldn't have invented it on your own. Mishpatim is you get it. So your level of appreciation for all these mitzvahs is different. Here you're more passionate, here you're less passionate, here you enjoy more, here you enjoy less. All of this is eschem. This is not Aisanu, this is all eschem. Why? Mitzad me, I don't need eidos, I don't need chukim, I don't need mishpatim. To me, it's all one thing. I connect with God. That's what a mitzvah is. Complete bittul to the Eibishter. I get what I need. So why do you need eidos, chukim, mishpatim, different levels, different types of appreciations? What do you need this? Mitzad uns, mitzad the sheresh haneshama is the kiyam hamitzvahs and asacha hecher and oifen, because we do it in a way of maha eidos, right? I'm you're eidos, chukim, mishpatim. I do bittul b'mitzias. And then what do we answer? The Rebbe explains at length. I'm not going to go into the whole thing at length. That no, as much as a neshama has this higher way of doing it, where it's eschem, you. I'm better, I do it different, I'm chacham, I'm bittul, I'm tahirahi, to me I don't need mitzvahs to resonate or whatever it is, I'm just all in. No, we also need the other, we need the body, and the body has its own agendas, and it has things it appreciates more, and it has things it appreciates less, and that's also important, and we need the merger of two in order for Hashem to get what He wants from us. Akoshan and Freilich and Pesach.